up online? Good morning. It's good to see you here. It's good to be back into old-fashioned Sunday school. Everybody knows where the coffee is by now, I trust. We're going to spend the next, really between now and Easter and maybe beyond, talking about the thought of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I'm particularly fascinated with, so you'll have to bear that burden. We've been spending our last year really talking about transfiguration, about how to change our perspective on how we see the world through our faith. We focused on contemplative practices and the interior life, but now I want to focus on the cosmos, on the world, and we're going to use Teilhard de Chardin to do that. I'll have more to say about him in a minute, but let's start our class with a prayer that he has written. I know this type is small, so you can listen. You don't have to say it with me. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet, it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time, that is to say grace and circumstances acting on your own goodwill, will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit, gradually forming within you, will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you to accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Amen.
George, can you send us a copy? I'd like to put it on my refrigerator.
Yes. I'd kind of hoped, Mac, you would have memorized it as I said it. But yes, we can do that. And the reason it's on the slides, despite the small type, is so that it will be posted with the slides on the old-fashioned archival page. So I will put it, Dan will put it, in the email that goes out next week. But in addition, you can always find it with the slides. Now, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is, as I said, a fascinating person. He was really writing mostly in the 19th century, born in the 1800s, and then lived into the 20th century, into the 1900s. He was born in France, immediately became interested in science, following his father's example. His childhood stories are all about collecting fossils in the various parts of France where he lived. He became a Jesuit and was in the Jesuit house there in France. The Jesuit house was banned later in his life, so he went into England where a lot of his formative thought took place. He was a non-combatant, served in the military, but a non-combatant role during World War I, and then served as a paleontologist, which is his formal training, was all in paleontology in China, where a number of his other writings emerged. He's a fascinating thinker because he was new, and he was marrying religion and science in a way that really wasn't being done during his time. Unfortunately, the Roman Catholic Church, remember I said he was a Jesuit, wasn't fascinated with his insights. And so many of his writings were not allowed to be published. And therefore, they weren't really circulated. And therefore, there was no conversation around them. You know, any great writer that produces work, it's really the beginning of a conversation. And it is through that conversation that those ideas are refined and applied and evolve. But that didn't happen with Teilhard de Chardin because his writings were not deemed to be orthodox. So as a result, reading his original works, which is fascinating, is also very difficult because his vocabulary is not going to be familiar. His context is not going to be familiar. And as a result, we're not going to go through his writings as we study his thought Instead, we're going to pick someone else who's already done that, Ilia Delio, who's a brilliant Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C. She's taught in a number of different places. Currently, she's at Villanova, and was a founding faculty member in the Omega Institute, which I'll have more to say about later. She's written a number of books on science and religion. The book we're going to kind of use as the backbone of this course is Making All Things New, but it's just one in I don't know how many books she's written. And if we have time, we will move from Making All Things New, which is really about evolution and the idea of Catholicity, which we'll talk about, into de Chardin's fascination with computers and how his thought might help us think about artificial intelligence, which I also think is fascinating because that's obviously something we're about to engage as a society, artificial intelligence. So that's a little bit about de Chardin. That's a little bit about Delio. She, by the way, will be with us in April, another wonderful thing to look forward to. The bookstore is bringing her in to speak, and so I'm hoping that our time together will make that even more interesting for you when she comes. You'll be ready and have wonderful questions waiting, and she's going to wonder how the Cathedral of St. got to be so smart. All right, de Chardin. So Teilhard de Chardin is, as I said, a paleontologist. And he articulated some fascinating ideas about evolution, which are influenced by his faith. We know of evolution as stemming from the thought of Charles Darwin. And evolution, as Darwin defined it, was natural life unfolding through a process of natural selection, a process that promotes or maintains adaptation and thus gives the appearance of purpose or design. You've all encountered this in some form or fashion. But often we think about it as random selection. You know, there are 5 kinds of pigeons. One has longer beaks than the other, and they hit a time when there are not as many worms as there used to be, and the ones with the longer beaks survive because they can actually find the worms, and the others die off because they cannot. That's a common perception of Darwin's version of evolution. I think not entirely right. De Chardin, of course, comes along later and says, let's change our focus. Instead of thinking of evolution as something that was kind of planted and focus on the essence of things as they unfold over time, let's look at how that unfolding occurs and what they're going to. This is a very major point in de Chardin's thought. What are they going to? They're not just being impelled by some beginning, but they're being drawn to some end. See the difference in thought and perspective? Not just being like the Big Bang threw everything out and it's just there expanding. Instead, there is a force inside of creation which is drawing it to something and drawing it to unity. So Teilhard de Chardin comes in and says, evolution is really biological ascent. See already the difference in concept. Biological ascent, it's a positive and creative convergence towards more complex life forms. What he means is that when you look at how things progress, the simple moves to the more complex. Life forms, which are individual entities in and of themselves, form and join with other life forms, and more and complex organisms and social structures emerge. And that's all because they are being drawn into unity, a unity they always had. We talked about that in the context of contemplative practices, that we're all connected. And sensing that connection is what gives us empathy and compassion and love, right? Because somewhere deep down inside, when we get in touch with the absolute that is inside of us, we recognize our sameness. We recognize our connectivity. Well, de Chardin is taking that concept and he's looking at evolution. He's saying, I can see it functioning here too, right? There's a connectedness, and the world is being drawn to union. Things are being drawn together. Matter is moving to spirit. Simple things are moving to complex things. All of that is being driven, guided, propelled by one force. So for us, I think, particularly when we think about what the church ought to be in a changing world, one question Teilhard would pose to us would be, how do we live with an evolutionary spirit? How do we live with an evolutionary spirit? Let me give you a more contemporary example of how that might play out. There was a wedding about 2 years ago. A guy named Harry married a woman named Megan. It's not clear Harry's parents were all that excited about the wedding. Megan's father actually never even showed up to the wedding. But a lot of the rest of us did. And what we heard was this fabulous sermon. I'm talking, of course, about the royal wedding in May of 2018. And the sermon was delivered by our own presiding bishop, Michael Curry. Here's the end of that sermon. How many of you saw that, either when it was preached or in some video of it? You remember how inspiring it was. I will admit to an undue sense of pride that it was an Episcopalian there. But you also might remember some of the facial expressions that were in the crowd. And it was not clear, at least to me, that everyone had that same sense of pride. Megan did. You could see almost a beatific vision on her face, and that was heartwarming. And her mother ultimately is captured with tears running down her cheek. Not so much with the Queen. And there were other members of the royal family that looked like, I don't know, maybe the chicken had been bad they had the night before. But that in itself, there's something brilliant about what Michael Curry did in that sermon. It could be seen and is true on one level. It's simply inspiring as he is, and it's about love, and why not? Because these are two people getting ready to live the rest of their lives together. But there's another level of that sermon, another level of sophistication that he goes to, totally consistent with Teilhard de Chardin's thought. And that is the distinction that de Chardin makes between open systems and closed systems. Open systems are systems open to change, willingness to engage the world around them, sensitive to the environment in which they live, constantly adapting and growing and changing, transcending, he might say. That's exactly the concept we talked about in terms of contemplative practices, so I know you know it. It's just now expressed as a social principle, an open system. You can see, I think, in the presence of Michael Curry behind that pulpit and the presence of Megan and the royal family, a sense of what an open system looks like. Change over time. This movement, not just across racial barriers and ethnic barriers, but socioeconomic barriers. This was a very unusual wedding in so many powerful ways. But you can also, I think, see what a closed system looks like. A closed system doesn't have those characteristics of openness. A closed system is one that, in fear of what might threaten it, winds up closing itself off, refusing to change, existing entirely on the resources it already has. You can see that, I think, in the faces of the royal family. And I'm not picking on them here. I'm sure they're doing the best they can. You just imagine where they come from and how they live. And you can see, I think, that it's fundamentally, in many ways, a closed system. And that distinction between open system and closed system might also have something to do with the difficulty that Meghan and Harry ultimately had staying in the royal family. But the point here is not to condemn the royal family. You can watch The Crown and get all you need about the royal family. And you can see their goodness and their humanity and their heart, and you can see how hard it might be to be them, right? Most people I've found are doing the best they can. But it does give us a good example of open system and closed system. And what Teilhard de Chardin is claiming is that evolution and the world are an open system, that change is part of life, and that our ability to adapt and to grow requires change, which invariably includes loss. You know, some people say we're all afraid of change. I think that's not true. If I win the lottery, that would be a change and I would welcome it. I think we're afraid of loss, right? I think we're afraid of loss, and that's different from just changing. So, this thing inside of evolution that Teilhard de Chardin thinks is powering that openness, that growth, that adaptation, that change, he refers to as deep Catholicity. Now, this is not the Catholic that we think of in the Roman Catholic Church necessarily. And it's not even just universal, which is how we translate our Catholic as it appears in our creed. Right? The Catholic Church, we say that's the universal church. He means something deeper and more sophisticated than that. Catholicity, to Teilhard de Chardin and people who've picked that thought up from his writings, is an intrinsic wholeness at the heart of life. He's speaking very metaphorically here, of course. An intrinsic wholeness at the heart of life, yearning to become more whole in and through the human person. So I've given you that notion of things being drawn into wholeness, simple moving to complex, matter moving to spirit. But now Teilhard is saying, and humans are a big part of that. They're kind of the tip of the spear, you might say. Yearning to become more whole in and through the human person that draws us toward a greater unity and love, which he ultimately defined as the omega point. This point out into the future where everything kind of comes together. You might think of the beatific vision or heaven as you sense it. But what Teilhard is doing, which is different, is talking about the change, the evolutionary change that is driving our species and in fact the whole world forward as being drawn to something. Not pushed away from something, but drawn to something so that God is both the creator of it, the prime mover, embedded in it, in our hearts and in our interior lives, and outside, transcendent, drawing us towards it. And he defines that inner sense of wholeness as Catholicity. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next session or so, is this idea of Catholicity, this idea of God's presence embedded in the heart of the cosmos, right? And we'll look at that through the lenses of quantum physics, for example. We'll look at that through other scientific disciplines. So it won't just be Teilhard's assumptions back in the beginning of the 20th century. You can look at how things he was wrestling with and for the first time insightfully seeing and therefore revealing for all of us to be also present in the cutting edge technologies that we are looking at today. And that's what makes him so exciting, I think. But before we do that, let's look at the history of Catholicity, if you will. Now, something that big over something through that long a period of time is more complicated than any simple story, but, I've only got 15 minutes. So, here is a commonly accepted narrative understanding of Catholicity and how it has evolved. I'm going to start with the focal point being what's known as the axial age. The axial age, and you've heard about this before. It's about 900 BC to about 200 BC. The axial age. So before the axial age, humanity exists in relatively small tribes, in relatively close intimacy with nature. I've used Van Gogh's Starry Night to illustrate this time because it seems, I've always thought in that wonderful impressionistic painting that you could almost reach up and touch the sky, touch the stars, the same feeling I get on a clear night during the era of COVID when we don't have so much pollution, right? When suddenly the stars are even more visible and you are drawn to them by their majesty, by the wonder and awe that they inspire. And you almost feel like you could touch them, like somehow you're part of them and they're part of you. And I think that sense of how humans interacted with the world was what dominated the consciousness, the self-understanding of folks in the pre-axial age. So it's largely a tribal environment. It's largely one where people believe that their actions affect the rest of nature and nature's actions affect them. So they're developing rituals and practices that involve sacrifice and other things, not just to assuage the gods, but literally to keep things going right. If the plants start dying because they're not able to reproduce, the fear is that that'll ultimately happen in humans too. And if humans aren't treating each other right, if injustice becomes the dominant sense of what's happening in the group, the fear is that that will affect nature too. They are interdependent, humans and nature. So we move from that period of time into the axial age, that 900 to 200 time, and what happens is that people begin to congregate into more urban settings. At first, the urban settings are ruled by the priest, but that falls ultimately, and as they gather, they experience new and different things, new and different people, new and different ideas of the world, and trade emerges, right? Trade, that great connector of people, right? And so people are having to live in this time, but what else do they experience? They also experience the other stuff that comes with other people. You know, meanness and selfishness and greed and crime and all of the other things that maybe had not been so predominant in their tribal societies. And so they start to think about things differently. And they start to develop what you might call a self-consciousness, a sense of themselves separate from nature. So you might still, remember the Greek city-states come into being during this time too. So the Platonic and thought that we're so familiar with is also emerging during this period of time. There is a sense of the individual and a self-consciousness about this individual. So even though this is a Leonardo da Vinci kind of sketching, which wasn't done until much later, it harkens back to an architect who actually was right about the end of the axial age. And they're worried at that point about whether a human being can be circumscribed by a circle and a square, things that might not occupy your mind on a regular basis. But it apparently did here. So this to me captures this growing sense of self that happens during the axial age. And what it means is that you have all these religious traditions that really emerge during that time with a sense of the absolute inside of them, right? So Hinduism produces its version of that. The Buddha comes along producing his version of that. And you can see the development of ethics and the sense of doing right and wrong. But as Plato said, if you go back to the Starry Night, you're not reaching out and touching the stars anymore as if you're one with them. You are instead standing there to gaze upon the stars and contemplate them. You have a sense of you as being different from that. And as a result, you analyze it, you think about it, you develop theories about it, implement principles associated with it. That's true for the stars, it's also true for society. So you have the beginnings of philosophy and science and other disciplines which have to do with looking at things as other and analyzing them. Now this has some resonance with the way we understand our minds today. You know, your brain's different from your mind, but your brain has two hemispheres, right and left. The right hemisphere, simply stated, tends to see things as a whole. The left hemisphere tends to see things in narrower terms. So one writer refers, I think, to the left mind as the self-conscious mind. You are conscious of yourself and you're thinking about things in that way, looking at the world to analyze it, to narrow it, to protect yourself, to figure things out. And the other side, the deep mind, she calls it the deeper mind, and it's about seeing things as a whole. It's much more of an open system, if you will, and it is there that she finds the presence of the Holy Spirit and the presence of God. The trick is to get these two sides of your brain, and therefore your mind, working together, not to be lost in your self-conscious mind, which starts to look like a closed system, but instead to be driven by the deeper mind, which is exactly what we're doing in our liturgy and our contemplative prayers. We're trying to access the deeper mind to make sure there's actually a flow there. This is all described by Ian McGilchrist in a book called The Master and His Emissary, which plays off a story that Nietzsche told about a great master who ruled his kingdom, but he had emissaries that went out and did what they were supposed to do. The point is, the deep mind is the master, and the self-conscious mind is the emissary. And the trick is to make sure that power dynamic stays in place. You might argue that at the beginning of the axial age, you've got the real beginning of the development of that self-conscious mind and all of the wonders that it brings. There's not a good or a bad here. You don't hear that, right? Right mind good, bad mind, left mind bad. That's not what I said. It's the flow between them. It's the connectivity between them that lets us look at things, transfigures our perspective to see the whole. So we have the axial age where all of this is changing, but what's happening is a separation between the way we see ourselves, humans see ourselves, and the way we see the world. So the world is an other. By the way, so are people not in our tribe. They're other too. So we've gone from a sense of connectedness to a sense of distance. And then we come after the close of the axial age, and I'm going to focus on the church now, into a different way of being, right? So Jesus emerges, I would argue, focusing on the deeper mind, but that's for another class. And what does the church do within 400 years after Jesus has died? We're arguing over doctrine. Now, I've used the Christ Pentecreator to illustrate this time period, and Christ Pentecreator is an icon that was in a monastery in Mount Sinai. It's probably from the 6th century. But what's fascinating about it to me, and for our purposes, is that if you look at it, you'll see that Christ is kind of divided down the middle. Can you see that? So that on the right-hand side, you get the human Jesus. The human Jesus is clutching the gospel. His eye has a slightly different focus. His facial structure also has a slightly different alignment. But if you go to your left, his right, with the blessing hand there, that's Jesus who is divine, right? You see the slightly wider eye and the blessing gesture. And this argument about how you dealt with the divinity and the humanity of Jesus dominated the first centuries of the church, particularly after Constantine, when the church is institutionalizing itself. And D. Chardin has some comments about this, but before he does, I want to tell you that I've heard 2 different explanations for the blessing hand that I think are interesting. This is the right hand on that icon. The first explanation comes from somebody analyzing the Pope, who also does a similar gesture. We do too, but of course we do it right. So what the Pope, the analysis that was offered by the Pope was that in the Jewish tradition, the blessing was done much like Spock might have done it, where you separate your fingers. But Peter, the first Pope, had carpal tunnel syndrome, and therefore his fingers wouldn't quite open up, and that ultimately led, out of respect, subsequent Pope did the same thing, and that's the blessing gesture. I think that's fun, but not right. Instead, if you'll really notice, that third finger is touching the thumb. And what happens out of that, there are a number of different things that symbolizes, but one of them is a gesture where the 3 fingers are actually standing for the initials of Jesus Christ in Greek. And so the blessing is the blessing of Christ, and that's simply to signify that. It goes further, but I like that. If you want to know the true story, the dean will be available immediately after class, and he'll explain it to you. But when you see those 2 fingers and you see that third ring finger touching the thumb, it has a deep, deep tradition. But the point I want to make to you is simply that what happens in the church really, again, most people are doing the best they can. Constantine's trying to run an empire. The church is trying to get things together, thinking that it holds on to Catholicity. It holds on to love. It holds on to that inner thing that is yearning to be whole, and it's going to manage it, and the church is going to be the body of Christ. But you wind up with these debates in an effort to bring the church together. You have all these Christological debates, and what happens is, according to Teilhard, Chardin, is you have people who are more worried about complying with rules to qualify for a life after death than you had people living in life, which was the original point of evolution of Catholicity. And that's where Teilhard de Chardin argues the church is still suffering from that consequence. Still suffering from a belief in abstract principles instead of a faith in an encounter with God. Sound familiar to our prior discussions of mysticism and contemplative faith? Right? So the promise then of Teilhard de Chardin is that if we look to nature for that guidance, if we see ourselves more interdependent with nature, which we are, we're going to find an encounter of God which will drive us into being agents of God's evolutionary spirit. And that's our calling as Christians, to be agents of God's evolutionary spirit. It doesn't mean that doctrine is bad. Doctrine, I think, when well constructed and utilized, is a lot like a road map or a map of the terrain. It tells you how to find that encounter with God, how to help distinguish between what's real and what's not. But like a menu for a meal, it's not really what you want to eat. It's just a guide to what to order. Okay, so before we close, and Mac, if you've got that microphone so that people online can hear, if you've got, I know this is a lot, but I want to introduce these concepts because we're going to be using them in the next several discussions. But do you have any questions or comments? Yes.
Chardin's focus on the direction of evolution consistent with intelligent design. Is it the same thing as intelligent design?
It's consistent with, but not the same. So what's, I think, really happening there is a choice between two different ways of seeing time. One, more associated with the Greeks, is that time is a circle, the great chain of being, and what we're really doing is trying to return to the source. But the Hebrew conception of time had always been more linear, right? And I feel like it's really an adaptation of the Hebrew conception of time, so things are continuing to expand and continuing to grow, and wholeness, the omega point, is not back there. We're not going back to the garden, contrary to more modern interpretations of the Genesis story. We are instead moving to the omega point, which is down at the end of that line, which is a Hebrew concept of time, I think. The notion there's an intelligent designer, yes, de Chardin believed that, as might other people. That's just, as did Darwin. That's to say there is a designer, there is a purpose, there's some intelligence really there. And that's where quantum physics is going to become really interesting, because they're saying the same thing while declaring their atheism in many cases, which is fascinating. Like, I'm cool, that's fine with me. Good question, thank you. Anything else? Nobody wants to know more about carpal tunnel syndrome? Because we got a doctor right here. He could explain it all to you. I'm sorry. We've got an alternate diagnosis here. Yeah.
Doctor?
It's Dupuytren's contracture that makes your fingers not straighten out, usually not carpal tunnel.
Oh, okay, thank you. Say that. No, say that one more time clearly.
Dupuytren's contracture.
All right, there you go. It's always important to get a cocktail party tidbit that's going to help you relate to people through the week. So thanks for offering that. Yeah, our orthopedic surgeon has given us a thumbs up back there, so must be good. Other comments or questions? Yes. Mac, can you, sorry. Mac's on, this is his workout for the week, so don't worry about where you are.
Please forgive me, I believe you went over this earlier, but are the ideas that you're presenting in a book that's for sale here, did you say?
Yes and no. Are the ideas I'm presenting in a book? Naturally, I'm making a lot of this up. But we are using a text that I'm suggesting you read if you're interested called Making All Things New by Elia Delio, and that's a 2015 copyright text, and it is available in the bookstore when we finish our renovations anyway. There's a subsequent book she published in 2020 called Re-Enchanting the Earth, which is about artificial intelligence. We may get into some of that. And she's dealt with evolution through her, 5 or 6 other texts. The book about Teilhard de Chardin, which I think is most interesting, is called Spirit of Fire, which is a biography by Ursula King, who's a scholar who's followed Teilhard de Chardin. I'll have that for you up here if you want it afterward, at least to get the title. So if you want to dive deeper into de Chardin, I would recommend that biography. His readings are all fascinating, but as I said, they're just very difficult to read. And we're going to focus on Elia Delio. So Making All Things New is the best answer to your question. Yes. Our former chair of the bookstore board reminds me that you can also order online at the bookstore. That's a problem with this class. No matter what you say, there's somebody who knows more about it than you do. John.
George, is it fair to say that what he proposes is somewhat consistent with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that the end point is self-actualization, which he defines as wholeness or the omega point? And is it fair also to summarize what he's saying as we're all in an evolutionary state, the end point of which is unity in love or wholeness?
We're just going to say yes.
Yeah. So another excellent question. I think it's consistent with it. I don't think it's the same thing. I think first, your summary of what he's saying is exactly right. This unity in love and wholeness and integration and integrity. And that is also kind of the end point of most stage theories. Not only Maslow's hierarchy, but Fowler for dimensions of faith, or Keegan on intellectual stage theory. They're all doing the same thing from different perspectives. But there's always some point that they, throw some exemplar like Jesus or somebody else they hadn't met into because they've never met anybody who actually achieved it. Fair enough. But they're all trying to mark out how that journey is followed. So consistent with, not the same as. Other stage theories would also be consistent with, I think. And the only difference is those stage theories tend to focus on people, personality development, intellectual development, and Teilhard de Chardin is talking about everything. The cosmos, all of creation, right? Which, by the way, until the Greek writers, first Homer, who in the Iliad was the first person to use cosmos, and then Plato and Timaeus, who actually interpreted that to be the world, that concept didn't even come about until the Axial Age. Prior to that, there wasn't even a word for all of that, because they just assumed it. Anyway, so yes. Anything else? All right. So, is Mac making faces behind me? What's happening with it? Harrison, it's your job to keep him straight. You know that. All right. So, a lot. Here's a quick summary, and then I'm going to end with some music, as I love to do. Teilhard de Chardin, paleontologist, Jesuit. He's writing at the beginning of the 20th century, and he's articulating a view of science and faith that seems to make faith integral to science and science integral to faith. He's articulating it in the context of evolution, but you can simply think of that as change, and changing, moving along a timeline where we're moving towards unity, where love is the force that is constantly drawing matter into spirit, simple into complex. And we are agents of that love. And that is how we live into being Christians with an evolutionary spirit. Now, there are a lot of ways to express Catholicity. One of them is through words. That tends to trigger your self-conscious mind, by the way. Beauty in its wholeness, lives primarily in the deeper mind, and so it's beyond words. So I'm going to leave you with sound and images that hopefully will take you into your deeper mind. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.